Start.
I have one. And this is probably for you, Gail. I was pleased to hear you talk about home ec. I grew up in the age where home ec was on the high school curriculum. So do you know to what extent is waste in the home impacted by the one or both homeowners having had home ec education?
This is a great question, and it's one that the FWRA really has not been able to get some good data on around. One of the things that we've hypothesized is if you look at the various generation, you've got the boomers and the Xers and the millennials, that there are different waste levels at those different generations because of their ability to handle food, cook, plan, et cetera. We don't have good data on it, though. It's just a hypothesis. But there's anecdotes that go along with that. Like the folks before the boomers, they didn't waste anything because they were the babies of Depression era, so they know how to use everything. And so it's interesting, though, that home ec seems to be coming back. My kids are in middle school, and they have a cooking class as part of what they call, I forget, there's a word for it, that they rotate every 8 weeks to some different class. And my son's been learning how to cook at school, which I think is wonderful, because there was a whole great group that didn't get to do that.
Yes.
Hi, Fergus. Paul Hanlon, Abbott Nutrition. So really great talks. It's really interesting, and I think a topic that a lot of us haven't spent a lot of time thinking about. So one of the things that we think about in the chemical contaminant side of ILSI is trying to find those positive news stories about what we're doing. And chemical contaminants is often something people only have negative connotations around. So in terms of making sure that people are not throwing away food that's perfectly safe to eat, this is one of the areas that we think we can start making some of those connections, that if we set really, really conservative regulatory limits, or if customers and consumers really push back on thinking things are unsafe when they really are safe, you're going to end up with a huge increase in food waste. Mm-hmm. So have you guys thought of either this story or other stories that you could try to build off of this food waste story? Help me out. Maybe let you change it. Help us out on the food safety side by, building up the story that food waste is important. And okay, so maybe another question would be, is this really resonating with consumers? And do you guys see a lot of consumer push to this is one of our important issues that consumers want to really focus on?
Yeah, so I will comment. One of the so we have a lot of data science around consumer behaviors at a branded food company, of course. And I actually met with one of our data scientists earlier this week around the upcoming trends for 2019. And I was pleasantly surprised that waste and transparency were two of the top 10, which is the first time anything that was really sustainability driven hit the radar on our annual update of consumer trends for the company. And so she sat down with me to talk about, well, so what do we do with this waste thing? And it's a really interesting conundrum that if you look at Pinterest, you look at Google searches, you look at some of those social media sites, there's a lot of interest in reusing waste materials in new forms. So repurposing leftovers into new recipes, this whole notion of waste to worth, it's really starting to catch some wind in the social media. So how do we turn that into action as a food company? I'm still not sure. But one of the other components that we're really concerned about is this date labeling. There are some NGOs out there that would argue that diversity in date labeling is the #1 root cause of food waste, which I call foul on that. It's actually not really true. But there is an opportunity for us to commonize date labeling and better train people on what that means. Best by is different than use by, and how do we, one's a quality metric versus a food safety metric. How do we get people to, you really don't have to throw your milk away on the right date if it's not chunky and doesn't smell bad, right? So, but people just don't generally know that. So I think there's a whole lot that we can do on the consumer front that really has been untapped to date. So thanks for the question, but I don't have a really good answer.
One of the other thing, in terms of consumers, I know in our, my students tell me that in the dining commons at our university, which is, by the way, ranked #1 in food, wasting food is almost like smoking now. If you're at a table and you take a lot on your plate, the other people at the table, the other students will say, "What the hell are you doing? You're just going to throw most of that away." So there's a lot of social pressure not to waste food. So consumers are doing it. I just don't think, like in most areas, the food industry hasn't yet understand how to tell a story about how they contribute to the minimizing waste. And I just don't think the story's been told.
I'm Spiro Stefano. I'm from the University of Florida. I'm an economist. I'll apologize in advance. And so I tend to, when I come to these kinds of sessions, I tend to start thinking about the demand side. We talk a lot about technology and the science side and what we can do. What about the demand side? Professor Tang talked about had that flow chart of the food system and the supply chain and talked about the feedback. Well, the message doesn't get back unless someone in that chain chokes it off. And who can choke it off? Whoever has the most power can choke signals. So these feedback effects, and we start to worry about these sustainability issues because we're a lot more affluent and we can worry about those. So my one question is that lots of times when we hear about food security, we're talking about food insecurity, which relates to income inequality, food access problems, and also sustainability. So how do you deal with this emerging social change where we are socioeconomic change, where we're getting wealthier and we can afford to worry about waste and think about others? Do you have any insights into that?
Well, as a partial economist myself, I think what is interesting is that structural transformation is occurring. Sorry, I'm using the economics term for him. Okay? And as part of the structural transformation throughout Asia especially, we're seeing the emergence of a middle class and the segmentation of a poorer class. Now, certainly the middle class is changing its diet habits tremendously. And part of that change, in fact, is a demand for quality food, certified food. Okay? Food that has gone through a supply chain, blockchain, whatever it is, yeah? And that's become really significant. I mean, the big, shippers I talk to, they try to respond to that. See, like rice is a good example, 60% of the world's population is in Asia. Most of them eat rice. Now, in the case of rice, there's now something called the Sustainable Rice Platform, okay, which is formed by basically a combination of public, private sector, and NGOs to try and define criteria, okay, where a certain exported rice can be labeled as sustainable. Okay? And this has been test marketed several times now, and apparently it meets the criterion that are expected by many consumers. Fish is the other one. Okay, working with WWF, quite a few groups have actually had their fish certified by WWF as being sustainably produced to meet that. Now, the big problem we have with regards to food, I think, in Asia, and this links to food waste, is the whole issue of food fraud. Okay? That's emerging as a really big issue. Okay? And that's also spun off another group of entrepreneurs. They're now finding ways to verify food identity, on site. I don't know whether you've heard of the iKnife. It's an amazing instrument that was first, patented in the UK and then brought to Australia. But basically, it's like a knife that you stick into meat, whether it's Wagyu beef or cod, and it vaporizes the molecules, and then through cloud technology, compares it with the spectrum, you can tell you straight away, is this really Wagyu? And part of the justification for this kind of instrument is that there's one survey in Boston that showed that 30% of all the sole that's caught is not caught. Okay, it's actually some other fish that I can't remember the name of. Yeah? So food fraud, I think, has become a big issue, which is also a cause of waste. Because once you create a panic, there's big dumping going on, okay, which institutionalized food waste, basically. But I don't think you can actually arrest the movement towards consumers, especially in Asia, with the world's kind of biggest number of people demanding better quality food. And quality, different meanings altogether. Yeah. That's a short answer to your question.
Yeah, I have a comment on it too, and it goes back to one of the slides that that Paulsa showed from the FAO. That you look at the proportion of food waste at the consumer level versus the supply chain level, the folks that aren't wealthy are not wasting anything at home. It's being wasted in the supply chain because of infrastructure deficiencies, not because of lack of interest. The people who are wasting more are those of us in the developed world who can't afford to. So even though socially we might be interested in it, it doesn't affect the outcome. So I would argue that we're actually upside down in terms of how we're approaching it on an economic standpoint. And there's real and tangible economic value of not wasting food, because just as a food manufacturer, I don't want to buy ingredients that don't get into finished products that I make a margin on. As a consumer, I don't want to buy food that's going to go into my little composting machine either, because that's a waste of my personal dollars. So I think the more people that can connect those dots, it is an economic issue. And I think that's a really important one for us to consider as we go forward and how we talk about it and how we think about it.
Courtney Bidney, General Mills. I just wanted to build on the previous comments around standardized date coding, and I thought, Gail, you sort of touched on it, but there is a trade group in the U.S. and a manufacturers associate, so manufacturers as well as retailer associations that have partnered together to come up with 2 standardized code dates, one that expires for safety, one that is quality oriented, and there will be a consumer education campaign around that to teach consumers that if it has the date for safety, it needs to be disposed of, and if it doesn't, it's really a quality date. So that work is happening, and it'll be rolled out with the new nutrition labeling changes that are happening in the U.S. The other example I thought I would share that's a little bit unique happened with a food recall situation. So we think about food recalls as being safety issues, and they often are, but they aren't always safety issues for the full population. So we had a recall that was due to a gluten-free product that was cross-contaminated with wheat, and so it was a class 1 recall because of this wheat wheat contamination. And at that point, we worked with FDA post-recall to actually relabel that product, or provide instructions for the food bank to relabel that product properly for wheat, so that that product could be consumed versus going to landfill. So that was a good example, because typically if it's a class 1 recall, it's headed straight to the landfill. And in that situation, we were able to work directly with FDA to come up with a mutually agreeable option. So I just wanted to share that as an example for the group, because I do think our regulatory agencies are more interested in partnering in that space to get food to people that need it.
Christy Reimers, Conagra Brands. Courtney, I was at our food bank recently, and I saw all kinds of our frozen meals there. I'm like, what happened? They said there was no soy allergen declared, so it too had to go to the food bank. What I'm thinking of, Ferg, you mentioned how in the university level, food waste is becoming a thing. What's happening in our high schools and elementary schools, middle schools? Is that still a real bastion for food waste? I mean, I just remember seeing trash cans full of trash cans full of food when I would go have lunch with my kids. And I don't know if there's been any kind of change in the schools that has started to focus on reducing food waste.
Well, I know of a couple of examples where schools have made it part of their curriculum to have the students actually segregate and separate their food waste, and they turn it into a math assignment, a science assignment. There was a really cool charter school in St. Louis that did that a couple of years ago, and we actually have a video link on it in our in that best practices guide that I shared earlier. So I think it's not institutional in terms of it's not being driven by the school lunch program. As a matter of fact, there was some interesting data that was shared by when they updated the school lunch program for more of the fresh fruits and vegetables, that more was going to waste because the kids were being compelled to take something that they weren't going to eat. And so they actually rolled back some of that in terms of enforcement in some places. So that there's some anecdotes about it, but I don't think there's anything systematic in place. But where they have done it, it's been really interesting for consumer, or for the curriculum
Yeah.
when they build it in.
Can I just chip in on this? I think in the non-US world, I think there are many other examples where schools have taken initiatives, sometimes isolated, sometimes more generalized. I had the privilege of visiting Finland a couple of years ago. Aya is not here. And most of their schools actually have very good programs to ensure portion sizes suit the kids. So there's almost zero waste in that respect. And it all goes to education. But you can do that with a smaller population. Whereas I think the state's so diverse, in your school districts are so variable, it's probably difficult to have something across the board, I think.
I have another question. Coming back to the theme here, which is technology on the consumer end to prevent or reduce food waste. How many people shop at Costco or Sam's Club? Oh, not very many. This is in a different kind of audience. Back when I was raising my son, I shopped a lot at Costco. Why? He's an only child. I had half a hockey team at my home half the time, and so I had to buy in bulk. And for a few years after he left home, I still bought in bulk and ended up wasting some of it. But I'm interested in what your thoughts might be. Costco, Sam's Club, there are a lot of stores that have consumer information. I know sometimes we're a little skittish about privacy, but they know what you bought, and they have the code date of what you bought. And if there is a recall, some of those stores automatically call you or email. Costco, for example, will call your home and leave a message and say, this item you bought with this code date, has a problem. Why couldn't, in the age of the Internet of Things, why couldn't that be turned into a way to help consumers manage their pantries and their food inventories, right? So the thing you bought that is about to expire, maybe you get a reminder and you use that instead of the newer thing that you bought. Or proactively, you go to buy a case of Campbell's soup, and the system says, oh, you still have a half a case of chicken noodle soup in your pantry. I mean, things like that to me are easy. Are there privacy issues around something like that that could help a homemaker manage their pantry or the refrigerator inventories?
So I'll take to start at that. So there's two thoughts. First of all, it would be very difficult for a retailer to do that because they wouldn't know if you'd already consumed the product. So they could call you with a reminder, and that could get really annoying if you'd already eaten it, right? So I know how the smart marketing that emails me over and over again about a new mantle for my fireplace 6 months after I've already bought one is really annoying, right? Okay, so that's one issue with that. But as I talked about the connected appliances, that's exactly what they do. So those smart refrigerators, they take an inventory. When you put something into your fridge, you actually scan it into the refrigerator, and you can do the same thing on your phone with your pantry. And it tells you when you consume it, it tells that you take it in and out of the refrigerator. The appliances are getting really cool about being able to help you with that inventory, and then they can also build your shopping lists for when you use something and they know you want it frequently to go put it on your list for next time. And so that whole dynamic around the connected consumer, that's exactly what that's trying to solve for. And some of them work really well. Yeah.
Any other questions? If not, I would like to thank the speakers. Thank Edith for co-chairing. Thank Heather for all the work you've done. Thank the audience for staying this long on a beautiful day, and we'll see you at the reception.